Well, good morning, everyone. This morning we are going to do a Plant ID, Weed ID webinar, and this webinar is being sponsored by the North Central SARE program. So it's a nice chilly day here in West Lafayette, and I'm Bill Johnson. I'm the Extension Weed Scientist here at Purdue. Joe Eichley is my program assistant in weed science, so he's going to assist with this presentation as well. We do have Walt Sell in the room here as well, and the questions that you have will be going to Walt. So Walt's email address will show up across the bottom of the screen. So if you do have questions during the presentation, email those to Walt. We may not get to all of them, but we'll try to answer questions at some strategic times throughout the presentation. The way that we're going to go about this morning is we have a PowerPoint presentation to show you that'll discuss some of the key features of weeds, and these are mostly agronomic weeds because that's the specialty that Joe and I are in. And we do have a key in there that we're going to utilize as well and show you how to use that key. And then we also have some live samples in front of us here, and we're going to do our best to try to show you some of these features on live samples. And then we have a little bit of a quiz at the end of this presentation, and for the purposes of this quiz, what we're going to have you do is email your responses to Walt, and we're going to see how that process works. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started now with the PowerPoint presentation. And Joe Eichley, who's my program specialist in weed science, Joe's done a lot of meetings for me the last couple of years. He's been my research technician for a couple of years, and unfortunately he's going to graduate and move on someday. But Joe is going to give the PowerPoint presentation. So Joe, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Bill, for the introduction. So what we're just going to do is, first off, define a weed and then go through some identifying characteristics of the different weeds that we'll deal with. So first, we really think of a weed as the definition is a plant out of place. So if there's a weed growing in your yard that you don't want, or a plant growing in your yard that you do not want, we would just simply call that a weed. Some other definitions are plants that are competitive, persistent, or harmful. We think of a plant like poison ivy that can be harmful, so we identify that as a weed. One weed that we deal with in row crops, giant ragweed, is very competitive with corn and soybean. So that's another one of these plants, very competitive, so we would identify that as a weed. Also those that impede or interfere with human activities or are undesirable. Something like kudzu that can overtake a forest, that can interfere with some of our planned activities in a forest setting, interferes with an activity, that would be a weed. The other thing that we look at for the agronomic sector, which is what Bill and I deal with, is if they have an impact on agriculture. So if they reduce crop yields through direct competition with our crops, if they lower crop quality, something like eastern black nightshade in a soybean field, when we harvest that, it stains the soybean seed, so it doesn't reduce yield, but it lowers our crop quality. Anything that can impede harvest, if we have a dense weed stand in a field, we actually can't combine those crops sometimes with our harvest equipment. Some of these weeds can also harbor insects and pathogens that can harm our crops in other ways. And then we have a number of weeds that can injure or poison livestock if they happen to step on them or eat these weeds. Those are also undesirable plants that we're going to say are weeds in those settings. So to start, we're just going to classify a few things about these plants. The first one's plant structure. Life cycle is the other thing that we think about when we're dealing with identifying and managing weeds. So first, start with plant structure. When we talk about plants, there's really two ways that we can define them. We can call them monocots or dicots. And these refer to the first plant structure that emerges from the ground. So a monocot is it's what we call the cotyledon, and that's one of those emerging from the ground. A dicot is dicotyledon, or two of these cotyledons that emerge from the ground at once. A more general way to classify these are monocots are our grasses and our sedges. Dicots tend to be our broadleaf plants. So you'll see some broadleaf plants in the bottom center of the screen, and we have some grasses on the right side of the screen. If we focus on monocots, as I said, we really have two of them that we talk about. That's our grasses and our sedges. And these can be identified by looking at a cross-section of the stem of these plants. So for grasses, we would tend to have a round or a flattened stem. So this picture on the top right of the screen, you can see kind of a rounded shape if we cut the stem. Sedges have a triangular shape. So the bottom right of the screen here, if we cut that plant right there cross section on the stem, it gives us a triangle look, and this is a sedge. So these can look very similar, grasses and sedges, to the untrained eye, but it's really this cross section of the stem that can help us identify between a grass and a sedge. As far as dicots, there's a number of different ways these plants can look. We're looking at leaf structure and arrangement. So these can have very unique looks. A lot of times grasses just kind of look like grasses to the untrained eye. But here on the screen we have 4 or 5 different broadleaf plants, and you can see a wide variety of how these plants actually look. This is why we just generally call these the broadleaf plants, and we'll look at different structures on these plants in order to help us identify them. So that's the basics on plant structure. If we move into life cycle, if we talk about the life cycle of one individual plant or weed itself, we're going to move through a number of series here. The first is a seedling. So here we have a seedling of a broadleaf plant or a dicot on the left side of the screen, and then on the right side of the screen is one of our grasses in the seedling stage. The seedling stage is typically when these cotyledons emerge from the ground, and then the first few leaves that we have that emerge from these plants is what we call the seedling stage. After the seedling stage, which will last between 2 to 4 weeks depending on what weed we have growing and the environmental conditions, we enter the vegetative stage. This is where we really see a lot of the weeds out in our agronomic fields when they're putting on a lot of biomass throughout the season. Here's just another example of a broadleaf on the left side of the screen and a grass on the right side of the screen. And this is one of the longest life cycles of the weed. It's when we really exit that seedling stage and before we start producing flowers and reproductive structures is this vegetative stage, which can be 2 to 3 months throughout the course of a growing season when we think about our agronomic crops. After the vegetative stage, we move into reproductive stage. And this is when we get our flower structures and start forming seed inside these plants. And so here, just again on the left side of the screen, we have a dicot. In the reproductive stage, there's a bunch of seed heads on top of that plant. On the right side is a grass, giant foxtail, in the reproductive stage. So those seed heads have a bunch of flowers and different seeds being produced all at this time. And this is when the plants start taking all the energy that they accumulated during that vegetative stage and repurposing them towards seed production in order to get mature seed and then survive into the next year, seed that will germinate the next year. We then enter what we call maturity or dormancy stage. On the left side of the screen is what we would identify as a mature, in this case an annual weed that is at the mature stage. This means that all the seed that was produced is now mature, and usually all the green tissue is gone, and we just have these brown stalks in the field with a bunch of seed that's mature and ready to overwinter and germinate the next year on it. On the right side of the screen is a perennial plant in the dormancy stage. So it looks very similar to the plant on the left that we would call the mature stage, but in this case, this perennial plant has seed that is mature, all the green tissue is gone, but this plant will actually regrow the next year from the root structure below that above ground tissue that we see. And so we just call this dormant. It's going throughout the winter. It's a way to sacrifice the above ground tissue so the whole plant survives, and then it will regrow from that base structure the next year. So that's just a difference of, we use maturity usually for summer annual weeds or annual weeds, and then dormancy for our perennial weeds. There's really 4 types of weeds that we deal with in the agronomic sector. The first is summer annual weeds, which we see on the top of the screen. These weeds will germinate from seed every year, typically in the spring. They go through that seedling and vegetative stage throughout the summer, and then sometime late summer or early fall, we enter the reproductive stage. That seed matures, that individual plant will die off in the winter, and they start again from seed the following spring. Below that on the screen we have winter annual weeds. These will typically germinate in the fall, sometime in the August to October time frame, produce a little bit of vegetative growth in the fall, overwinter in some sort of phase. A lot of them will be in these structures we call rosettes. Not all these weeds overwinter in the rosette phase. And then the following spring, they'll add a little bit more vegetative growth and then enter reproductive stage early spring. And usually by late spring to early May, or to early summer, May, June timeframe, these weeds mature, and then they die off in the summer, and then the seed will be available to germinate the following fall. The other weeds that we'll deal with is something called a biennial. So these have a distinct 2-year life cycle where they germinate in the spring of the first year, enter vegetative growth stage in the summer, and then the fall of that first year. In that first fall, then they overwinter, much like a winter annual. But then the following spring, they enter reproductive stage, and they'll be in that reproductive stage throughout most of the spring and summer, and then enter that mature phase in the fall. Following winter, that individual plant will die off, and then a new plant can germinate from the seed that was just produced and enter that 2-year life cycle again. Perennials are another weed that we'll face a lot, and these are plants that typically germinate in the spring, enter vegetative stage in the summer, a reproductive stage in the fall, and then they overwinter and begin that process again the following spring. And this cycle will repeat until that plant dies. So it's not just weeds. One thing that we think about for perennials are trees in our backyard. So we have that vegetative growth throughout the year. It matures in the fall, starts again in the spring. A number of plants in the landscape have this type of life cycle, and a few of our important weeds have this type of life cycle, which gives us a different set of challenges for managing these weeds versus our annual plants. So the next couple of slides just kind of summarizes what I just went through about the life cycle of these plants. So summer annual weeds, this just basically says what I just said for that timeline there. But these are some of our challenging weeds to control when we think about controlling weeds in corn and soybean plants. And we have a picture there of common lamb's quarter. That is one of our more common weeds, and we have some live samples to show you of that plant later. But these plants basically have the same life cycle as something like our corn and soybean crop. So we think of these as some of our most problematic and common weeds to control in corn and soybean. We do have a number of winter annual weeds that we face in corn and soybean crops. Usually that's early season. As I said, they tend to mature at about that time we're planting or have just passed planting corn and soybean. But these weeds can be competitive in something like wheat. And so here's where we'll get our phone calls every year of winter annuals and a winter annual crop. Those are our challenging weeds to face in that type of cropping system. There are a number of biennials that we try to manage every year. Not so much in the corn and soybean crops. Typically, since we either till or use herbicides at the beginning or end of a year, these biennials don't persist that often in a row crop situation. But one weed that we get calls on every year is poison hemlock. So this is one of our biennials. Year one, you can see on the left side of the screen, we have that vegetative growth stage. And you can't really tell from this picture, but those plants are probably ankle to knee high in August or September of this given year. Producers don't normally recognize this weed in the first year. It's when we get into May and June of year two that this plant grows to about 6 feet tall. You can see the flower structure on the right side of the screen. This is when we get phone calls of this weed kind of came out of nowhere, but it had actually been there for probably at least 18 months before we get phone calls on it. So just one of our more problematic weeds that we'll see every year out in the landscape. This is also one of these poisonous weeds for livestock. They will typically be consumed by a livestock in the first year, where that vegetative growth is more palatable than the second year. And that's really when we get these phone calls of livestock that are acting kind of funny after eating this weed. We have a number of different types of perennials. On the left side of the screen there, you'll see what we call a simple perennial. Everyone recognizes this one. This is dandelion. And so a simple perennial will regrow from that root structure that you see the plant growing out of there. So the reproductive stage is just a simple taproot that the plant will regrow from the following year. We also have what we would call a creeping perennial. So you'll see the top right of the screen is Canada thistle, and this has underground structures that spread throughout the soil that the plant can produce vegetative growth from at many points along these reproductive structures. When When it is underground, we call that structure a rhizome. When it is above ground, we would call it a stolon. And there are a number of plants in our row crops and also in turf that have this type of creeping structure for these perennial weeds. Just to give you an idea of how aggressive these underground structures can be, here's a picture that old weed scientists at Purdue, Merle Ross, did this study a couple of decades ago, I believe, where he planted Canada thistle, one section of a rhizome of that underground structure, 1 year in this box, came back a year later and dug the box up. You can see the above ground tissue on this picture. That's about knee high. It doesn't look like there's that much going on above ground, but you can see below ground that box is 4 or 5 feet tall by at least that wide, a little wider. And you can just see all this root and rhizome growth going on underground. So that is 1 year of growth. That gives a pretty good idea of why this weed can be challenging to control, just because of the sheer amount of biomass it can produce underground, even though it doesn't look like a whole lot is going on above ground. So that's kind of the run through there of classification. As I said, we look at plant structure and life cycle. Just, the review of plant structure, we're really talking about monocot versus dicot, or those grasses and sedges versus the broadleaf weeds. So we also look at different parts of a monocot or a dicot for identification of these weeds. The first one would be for the monocots for grasses. We look at this region called the collar region of a grass for identification, and there's 5 things that we can look at to identify these grasses, and they're all listed here on the screen. The blade is just that grass blade that we'll typically see. We have a structure called the midvein. On some weeds, this can be very prominent, and it's just the main vein that goes right in the middle of that leaf. We'll also have some of these plants have what we'll call a ligule, and then some have these auricle structures that we'll show a few examples of. And then each of these plants will have what we call the leaf sheath, and that's just a structure that surrounds the stem that is coming out of that is emerging from that latest leaf that was just produced. So first I want to focus on the ligule. And this is a translucent structure that a lot of these grasses have. On the screen here we have 2 different types of ligules. On the left side of the screen we have what we call membranous ligule. So some of our common weeds like Johnson grass and shattercane tend to have this membranous type of ligule. So if you look at Johnson grass, it's this structure here that I'm surrounding with the arrow. Shattercane, it's this structure here. So these are both membranous ligules, but you can see that they can have different looks about them. This Johnson grass one might be a little more wider versus the shattercane one, but this would both be what we call a membranous ligule. If we look at another species, we have 2 foxtails here, giant and yellow foxtail. They have what we would call a membrane tipped with hairs. So it's still that membranous translucent type structure, but we'll have some small fine hairs on top of that membrane that can be a little difficult to detect unless you get really good at looking at these weeds, and you'll be able to tell that yes, there are indeed some hairs on top of that membranous type ligule. These are some of the things that we look at for identifying grasses. The other thing that we look at is these auricles, which are these structures on the screen that look like they're clasping around the stem. There's a few of our weeds out there that we have that have auricles. One of our biggest ones that we'll look at is something called quackgrass. This is actually a perennial weed, but it's very easy to identify versus some of our other grasses because it has what we call these clasping auricles. So auricles are not always this obvious on a grass plant, but in the case of quackgrass, you can see that it is actually clasping around that stem and very easy to identify that plant structure. Some of our weeds, the next one on the screen, barnyard grass, this is one that actually does not have that ligule structure. So I'm switching back here and talking about ligules versus auricles. But barnyard grass is really our only agronomic weed that does not have a ligule. So if you bend back and look at the collar region of that plant and it does not have a ligule and you're in a corn or soybean field, you can bet that that's probably going to be barnyard grass. Just showing a few more structures. Bermuda grass we'll often see in turf settings. Sometimes some parts of the state like southern Indiana might see this in a corn or soybean field. It can thrive on sandy soils in warmer climates. But Bermuda grass would have what we call a stolon. So we showed Canada thistle, which has a rhizome. Bermuda grass has a stolon, which is basically a rhizome that is above ground. So it's just these reproductive structures that spread along the ground. A lot of people will just tend to call these runners instead of stolons, and you'll see this plant just spreading on top of the surface and having a lot of vegetative tissue emerging from this particular structure. Then to the right side of the screen, we're showing a sedge again, just another cross-section of that triangular stem that identifies it as a sedge. Our biggest sedge that we deal with in Indiana is yellow nut sedge. You'll see this weed in turf and agronomic fields, particularly in low spots that don't drain very well, is where a sedge will tend to thrive. The other thing that we look at for grasses is the leaf blade itself. And there's a number of things that we can look at for leaf blades. One of the first things that we look for is hairs, particularly the absence or presence of hairs. And we can identify different weeds based on if there's hair on the upper surface, on the lower surface of the leaf blade, or on both surfaces. We also look at the leaf margins of grasses. There's a number of different ways these leaf margins can present themselves. They can be wavy or crinkled. The leaf margins themselves can also have hairs or not have hairs, depending on the species. The blade can also have different growth habits. We can have blades that are twisted. They just tend to come out of the stem and twist, sometimes 360 degrees or more as they are growing. We could have curled leaf blades, or a particular type that we would call keeled. And this is something that we'll see in the bluegrass species. And keeled is just kind of a fancier way to say it has kind of a canoe-shaped tip on it. So that's another vocabulary word to add today. Keeled, I always use boat-shaped tip because it's easier for my brain to remember. So when we're talking about looking for hairs on a leaf blade of a grass, here again, the left side of the screen, we have Johnson grass and shattercane. If we bend the leaf blade back and look up into a light, we can see that there are no hairs present on either of these plants. Here on this third picture, we have giant foxtail, and this can be difficult to see sometimes unless you're holding the plant up in the light, or I like to sometimes wet the leaf surface and water can get trapped in these hairs and be easier to see. But if we bend the giant foxtail leaf blade back and look at it, we can see these short, dense hairs on the leaf surface. There's some unique plants, one in general is yellow foxtail, that the majority of the leaf blade itself does not have hairs on it, but yellow foxtail has these long wispy hairs near the collar region of the leaf. This is one of our unique weeds in agronomic crops where if you see those long wispy hairs, you can basically bet that that is yellow foxtail. But again, just to reemphasize, those hairs are generally in the bottom 1/3 of a leaf blade close to that leaf collar region. You won't see those hairs on the rest of that leaf, so it's really a unique structure to look for on yellow foxtail. Showing again some of our grass stems. So as I said, our grass stems can be rounded or flattened. The first three, Johnson grass, shattercane, and giant foxtail, all have these rounded stems if we do a cross-section of them. Some of our grasses, such as yellow foxtail, barnyard grass is another one that we face, has a flattened stem. So some people might think that still looks kind of rounded, but it is indeed flattened, and you might not always see this in a good picture of a cross-section, but if you hold the stem of these grasses in between your thumb and your forefinger, and if you roll it back and forth, it's a little easier to tell rounded versus flattened if you try and identify a weed that way. You can also identify the triangular nature of a sedge by using the same rolling technique. You can feel the three distinct sides if you roll the stem between your thumb and forefinger. So when we talk about grass ID, we typically don't want to be IDing grasses at this stage if we're trying to control them in a corn or soybean crop. But seed heads are another way that we can identify grasses. There's two different types of seed heads that we talk about for grass identification. On the left, we have what we would call a spike seed head structure. Several of our grasses, such as the foxtails, have this spike structure. And on the right, we have what is called a panicle. So something like Johnson grass, fall panicum, it gets its name from having a panicle. Just the two different types of structures that we have for seed head identification in grasses. To show some of the different ways that these can present themselves, once again using Johnson grass and shattercane as our examples. The left side of the screen, we have Johnson grass has what we would call an open panicle. It derives its name just from this. You can see how the seeds are very far away from each other, just has kind of an open nature for the panicle structure itself. Shattercane would still have what we would call an open panicle, but it's a little more compact, but we would still call this a panicle. And this is sometimes where weed scientists start to fight with each other. So we called it a spike in the last slide. Sometimes we get argued with that it's a compact panicle for the foxtails. But whether it's a spike or what we would call a compact panicle, it's the foxtails such as giant and yellow kind of have the same structure here, where you can see it's vastly different from that open panicle structure of Johnson grass and shattercane. Grass seed is another way that we can differentiate our grasses. It usually takes a pretty good trained person to identify a grass by the seed structure. You can see that the untrained eye, a lot of these just look like small grass seeds. You can usually at least tell which plant family it's in or which grass family it's in based on some of the things that we look at for a seed. But if you look at the scale on this picture, a lot of these are 1/2 millimeter in length. So you really need a good magnifying glass and some training to identify them, but there are some differences that we can tell between our different grass species when we just look at the seed itself. So that just kind of, just coming back and summarizing these different parts that we look at on a grass. The blade, we're looking at the differences in hairs, absence or presence, whether the leaf hairs are on the top or the bottom of the blade, or even on the side itself. The midvein in some species, I say, can be very prominent. In our row crops, Johnson grass and fall panicum tend to have a very prominent or a thick white midvein that helps identify those two grasses from some of our other more common ones. Ligules, we have the different types of ligules, also the presence or absence. Once again, I'll just mention that barnyard grass is one of our easier ones to identify because it does not have that ligule structure, so it's pretty unique versus some of our other agronomic grasses. And then auricles, there's differences in auricles that we won't have time to get through today, but you can have those clasping auricles like we showed with quackgrass. Sometimes they're very small auricles. Like some of our cereal grains will have smaller auricles, then sometimes they have hairs and no hairs. But as I said, for our introductory identification webinar here, it's not worth going into the differences in those auricles. A lot of times you need a magnifying glass to tell those differences. And in the leaf sheath, we're really looking at that rolled versus flattened sheath for grass identification. So grasses tend to be some of our more difficult to control or difficult to identify weeds, just because we're really looking at that collar region or the differences in hairs on different structures. Broadleafs tend to be a little bit easier to identify because we have a wide variety of how these broadleaf plants look. Things we're looking at on a broadleaf weed are leaf type and arrangement, the cotyledon and leaf shape, leaf margins of individual leaves, and then the presence or absence of pubescent hairs on stems and leaves can be other ways to identify broadleaf plants. So some of these structures that I mentioned before, when we look at leaf type or arrangement, on the left side of the screen, we can have what we call a compound leaf, which an easy way to put it will sometimes have what we would call 3 leaflets around one central structure. So that would be a compound leaf type. A simple leaf is generally just one leaf coming off of the main stem. And then the cotyledon leaf, so a dicot, once again, 2 cotyledons, and these cotyledons can be, their shape in general can identify some of our broadleaf plants for us. As far as arrangement, we're looking at 2 different arrangements of leaves for a broadleaf plant. The first one would be alternate leaf arrangement, and this is simply that the leaves come off of the stem one at a time as the plant is growing. We can also have opposite leaf arrangement. So 2 leaves coming off the stem, 2 or more leaves coming off the stem at the same point on the stem itself, and we would call this opposite arrangement. One other structure I'll point out here is this thing called a petiole, and this is what connects the leaf itself to the stem. Not all plants have a petiole. Sometimes the leaf is connected directly to the stem. We would call this a sessile leaf structure. And then we have the ones that have these petioles. And sometimes the petiole length can help us identify a certain weed. 2 weeds that we get a lot of phone calls on every year are water hemp and Palmer amaranth. They are both pigweeds. They look very similar. In the case of Palmer amaranth, we look at the petiole, and what we look at for that is the petiole length, and the petiole is usually longer than the leaf blade itself. So that's one of these things that we can look for identification purposes. We also talk about cotyledon and leaf shape. Just a number of our cotyledon shapes that we have on the screen, and a number of broadleaf plants can have, we'll see all of these potentially in the same field if we have enough broadleaf weed species in the field. But things like, just from left to right here, kidney, linear, lanceolate, oblong, oval, ovate, round, and spatulate are all the different cotyledon structures, cotyledon shapes that we can see on different plants. And we have some live samples to hopefully really show some of those differences if we can get focused enough with our cameras. And then leaf margins, so the last picture was the cotyledon shapes. We can have some differences in leaf margins for identifying these weeds. So entire would just be more of a smooth structure around the leaf margin, and more of this rounded structure. We can have lobed, where you'll see these parts of the plant that kind of go back towards the main vein would be here, a lobed structure. Here's a vocab word for you, pinnatifid. We have a few plants that have this type of structure, none with us today for our live samples. We can have serrate or toothed leaf margins. You can see it's kind of similar to lobed, but much finer, so we would call this serrated or toothed. And then undulate is another one that we have that will have a few of our weeds with that type of structure. So we passed out this weed ID key. Probably doesn't show up too well on the screen here, but we're just going to show an example of how to run through this identification key. In this case, on the screen, we have the broadleaf identification key, so page 66. This page and the page 67, I believe, run together. For identifying broadleaf weeds, we look at the cotyledons first. When we want to control weeds in an agronomic setting, we hope the cotyledons are still present, because if these weeds get too big, the cotyledons fall off, but at that point, they're usually too large to expect good weed control. But we'll look at something like the cotyledons first. So in this example, we have our linear or lanceolate cotyledons. If that type of cotyledon is present, we would go on to the next part of the screen. And this is a little too small for me to read on the screen, and I forgot my hard copy, but it looks like we're looking at leaf.
First true leaf.
Yeah, for the first true leaf. So we're looking at opposite or alternate. So if we would go to opposite, then we go to the right side of the screen, and then we're looking for
cotyledon shape. Still goes back to cotyledon. Oh, ochrea.
Yeah, so whatever we're looking at here, if you look at it on your structure, we'll just say it's yes or no, whatever that is. If we have yes, most of our common agronomic weeds, it would only be common cocklebur that would have those linear cotyledons, the opposite leaf structure, and then yes on that part of the diagram. And then, as I said, page 67 kind of goes along with page 66 because we have so many differences in our cotyledon shape. We could have these four different cotyledon shapes, which are ways that we can start with this weed key.
I may interrupt you here when you finish your comments on this key.
All right. And so, just so I can see this one easily, we sometimes have what we would call a butterfly shape, and that will indicate some of our morning glory species. So that's kind of the two different pathways that we start for using this weed ID key for the broadleaf weeds. The grasses is the two following pages. Don't have those on our PowerPoint to show you how to run through that, but typically we'll start with that rounded or triangular stem and then go through the different identification characteristics of a leaf collar and the leaf blade that we just showed earlier to identify those grasses. And so at that point, I think we're going to switch over to show some of our live samples here to show you some of these different characteristics that are on these plants.
Yeah, so thanks, Joe. So Joe kind of got the burden of giving the long part of the PowerPoint presentation since I'm fighting a little bit of a cold here. But what I want to point out on this key, and this is kind of an area where when we get into training programs, sometimes we get people tripped up, particularly when the instructor, somebody like me, forgets to mention this. But as Joe mentioned, what we're going to do on broadleaf plants is we're going to look at the cotyledons. And once we determine the cotyledon shape, then there's one of 5 different areas you can go to. So on the first page there, you see the linear or lanceolate, and that's kind of right in the center of that first page. If your cotyledons aren't linear or lanceolate, you're going to go to the next page and try to match up the cotyledon shape in one of those 4 boxes. So really, once you get to cotyledons in, that's going to point you to one of 5 different places, and then you work your way down through that dichotomous key. So I think what I'd like to do with some of these plant samples here is go through an example of some of the cotyledon shapes. And so why don't we start off with, well, we kind of referred back to morning glory. So why don't we start off with the morning glory? And what I'd like to do, if at all possible, so I can actually see myself here, that's pretty cool. Okay, here's an example right here between my index and middle finger where you can see the cotyledon of this particular morning glory. All right, so that's the cotyledon, and then the first true leaf would actually be this leaf right here. Okay, so that's the first true leaf. So if we could go back to that broadleaf key now, let's think about what that cotyledon looked like, and let's go back to the previous slide. And so if we look at that cotyledon key there, we're going to go to page 67, and in the lower right-hand quadrant of that, you'll see what we call butterfly-shaped cotyledons, and that's what this morning glory has, is a butterfly-shaped cotyledons. Now, as we go down to the next slide below that, so it's going to take you down that path. So it's going to be tall morning glory, it's going to be ivy leaf morning glory, or pitted morning glory. And this one is pretty easy because the shape of this cotyledon, if you look at pitted morning glory at the very bottom, maybe if we can go back here, this is the shape of the cotyledon of pitted morning glory. Okay, so that one was pretty easy. All right, now let's do another one here. Okay, I'm going to come over to this weed right here because this is one that appears to be re-emerging in importance, particularly as we use more dicamba in soybeans. So this is a plant here, and many of you can probably look at this and you're going to say, what? Velvet leaf, buttonweed, whatever we call it. So unique cotyledon shapes. So Joe did a great job of growing these samples, but if you look at this plant right here, in front of my thumb is a cotyledon for velvet leaf. Okay? One of the unique things about velvet leaf is the cotyledons will have slightly different shapes. You're going to have one that's round and one that's heart-shaped, and I'll just turn this one a little bit like that. So I'm pointing right here, so you can see that one is more of a round shape, and if I point at this one right here, this one really has more of a heart shape to it. So let's go back to our key, and again we're going to go to this page right here. So we're going to look at our cotyledon shapes. Now hopefully what you can do is you can see, again we're going to go to one of these 5 places. If you go to page 67 and you look at the lower left-hand quadrant, you can see it says round or heart-shaped something. Round or heart-shaped with a, I don't know what that says. Anyway, but that basically takes us down the pathway of 3 weeds that are all in this family, in the mallow family. And so if you work your way down through that key, I don't even know what that first page says. That first one says, are the first true leaves alternate? All right, so let's go back then and look at the plant. So if we take a closer look at the plant here, I'll try to do this without tearing it up. Joe, this stuff stuck together. All right.
Probably just pull one out.
There we go. Yeah, let's just pull one out here. That's a good point. All right, trying not to create too much of a mess here in the studio. All right, so if we pull one of these guys out, we can see this is our first true leaf right here. Our second true leaf is right here. So let's poll the audience. Let's email Walt. Is that an alternate leaf or is that an opposite leaf? And Walt, once you get about 2 or 3 of those coming in, just let me know and see if we get them right. So again, what we're looking at here is we want to determine whether or not we have alternate leaves or opposite leaves. The first true leaf is right here. The second true leaf is right here. And again, I'll point out as these email responses are flowing in, we've got one cotyledon that's kind of heart-shaped. The other cotyledon is more roundish. So Walt, do we get any responses yet? Okay, I'm going to give you guys the answers. All right, so these are alternate leaves, all right, alternate. If it were opposite, you would have one coming out right here, okay? All right, so let's go back to our key. So if we go back to our key then, and we work our way down the pathway, first true leaf, opposite or alternate, it's going to take us down to the left, and this is velvet leaf. So once again, the key works. Okay, let's go to another one that can present a little bit more of a challenge. And let's see. We've actually got 3 of the pigweeds here. So I'm going to find a good pigweed cotyledon. Here's one here I think I can make work. And I'm going to go ahead and pull this plant out. Okay, so this is one of the pigweeds. And how do I know that? Well, we grew it in our greenhouses. That's the seed we put in there. All right, but cotyledons are right here. And if I kind of turn that up on the end, pull that back a little bit, you can see those cotyledons. All right, kind of long, sort of skinny. So let's go back to our key. All right, let's take a look at our key. So where are we going to go with our key? Are we going to be on the first page, page 66, or are we going to be on the second page? Well, I think we're going to be on the first page. We're going to call these linear or lanceolate cotyledons. And then we're going to go work our way down the key, and I just happen to know that all the pigweeds are on the left-hand side, in addition to another weed that I want to point out here. But if we work our way down the key, you'll find that this is a pigweed that doesn't have any hair on it. So look for a question that asks for hair. And I can't tell what some of the other questions are. Probably a long, skinny leaf. But this is basically going to be your water hemp plant. Now, while we're on that page, I want to show you the cotyledon for another weed that's in there. You can see, do we have that? We have Jimson weed. Do we have nightshade under that cotyledon?
It should be the next.
Nightshade's going to be on the next page. I want to show you an example of where sometimes we can get confused. So here's an example of nightshade, and I'll pull one out here that has cotyledons on it without destroying it. Okay, so here's an example of a nightshade plant, and I tell you what, this camera work is amazing. This is working out great. If you can see the cotyledons on this nightshade plant, they're right here, right next to where my ring finger is pointing, and these cotyledons sometimes can be a little bit confusing with the pigweed cotyledons. So it's real easy to confuse these plants when they're small because the nightshades will kind of be a little bit purple, and the pigweeds are usually going to have a red coloration. So compare the cotyledons here. So notice the pigweed is kind of longer and skinnier, and the nightshade, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, a little bit shorter and wider. But this is why when you're doing weed ID, it's always good to have lots of samples out there to look at. Okay, let's go back to our key now. And we're going to be on page 67. So if we're in the upper left-hand corner, you can see again that cotyledon shape, a little bit longer and skinnier than what we had with the pigweeds, and you're going to work your way down the key, and this is going to be Eastern Black Nightshade. Eastern Black Nightshade and Hairy Nightshade will look a lot alike, except Hairy Nightshade obviously has a lot of hair on it. Okay, so I went through a few of those. I'll show you a few more examples, I guess, of some of the things that Joe brought up just in terms of the characteristics of broadleaf plants. So one of the things Joe talked about was petiole length. And so here's an example here. This is a Palmer amaranth plant. And I'll tell you one thing that we learned about Palmer amaranth this morning is it does not like cold temperatures. And so just expose it to 29-degree air temps for however long it took us to walk from Lily Hall over here to Stewart, and you'll take care of your Palmer amaranth. But one of the things Joe mentioned was this petiole length. So here we talk about Palmer amaranth having petioles that are longer than the leaf blade. And so the way to determine that then is you basically fold this over right at about the base here, and the petiole is longer than the leaf blade, just a little bit longer in this case. Now one area where you can get confused is if you look at leaves that are on the top of the plant. Typically these are not as developed, and what you can see here is the petiole length of this particular leaf right in here. This petiole is shorter, but again, that's at the top of the plant. So you want to look at leaves that are mature, that are on the lower part of the plant. So that one is Palmer amaranth. And I think I'm going to talk about one other characteristic, and then we're going to move on to the grasses. All right. The other thing I wanted to talk about is sometimes we talk about plants having a texture or something that looks like it's been coated on the plant. Here's an example of a lamb's quarter. And lamb's quarter has this stuff on the top of it that looks like you put flour on it. We call this is a mealy substance. Not exactly sure what it's called. But a lot of times when lamb's quarter is small, we can confuse that with nightshade and pigweeds as well. And this mealy substance at the top here will determine that it is lamb's quarter, and obviously some subtle differences in leaf shape as well. Okay, Walt, do we have any questions flowing in yet on any of the broadleaf stuff? Okay, no questions yet. All right. Next thing I want to do then is spend a little bit of time talking about grasses. And then what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to do a quiz, an online quiz with the participants here and see how that works. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about, let's talk about this one right here. So when Joe went through the presentation, he discussed ligules. So remember that ligules are basically going to be found right in this leaf collar region right here. Okay, now, so the way that you determine what your ligule is you got to have really good eyes or a hand lens at first, and I don't have my reading glasses, but you're going to pull the leaf back. Actually, I think I'm going to pull one of these out. And
Might be a little harder.
Okay, Joe says that's going to be harder. All right, we're going to try to do this the old brute force way. So I'm going to pull this leaf blade back right here, and I'm going to look at the area right under my index finger. So as I pull that back and take a close look, oh, that shows up great. Man, you guys with the cameras are outstanding. Can everybody, I got my finger in the way. Can everybody see right above my index finger there? So that is, there we go. That is a short fringe of hairs. So that's the short fringe of hairs that Joe talked about with ligules, and that's very common of the foxtail species, fall panicum. There's probably a few others I can't think of right off the top of my head. But anyway, that worked out great. Now I want to show you what barnyard grass looks like. And let's see here. Here's barnyard grass. So if anybody remembers what we said about barnyard grass, it does not have a ligule. So I'm going to try this right here. And if we can focus in right in this area, I'm going to pull this back very gently. And if you look, I think I might have broke the leaf blade, but if you look closely in that area right there, you'll see no fringe of hairs, no membrane, no nothing. It basically looks like skin, and that means it has no ligule, okay, and that's a characteristic of barnyard grass. Okay, The last one I'll show you then is Joe talked about oracles, and there's three main plant species that we deal with in agronomic systems that we know have oracles. Remember, oracles are the little finger-like projections that surround the stem of the grass, and it's very unique to things like quackgrass, to wheat, and to annual ryegrass or Italian ryegrass. So what I want to do is kind of show you what that looks like here. So let's find a single plant. I'll tell you what, this stuff is thick. All right. We'll go in this corner right here. And so if we can focus on this area right here, I'll hold this as still as I can. And if we can get zeroed in on that, there we go. And you can see those oracles that are surrounding the stem of that grass. So I'm going to try to pull this back here and see if the oracles separate as I pull this back. Okay, should be right under my finger. Okay, yeah, if you look really closely, you can see that. It might be a little bit tough on a computer screen, but again, great camera work there. So that's what oracles look like. Okay, any questions yet, Walt? So we're down to our last few minutes here. Okay, so what we want to do, and again, get your fingers ready to type. We've got a few examples we're going to show here. We probably won't get through all 15 that we have, but we want to show you some examples, kind of do a little bit of a quiz. Hopefully you've got the key in front of you, and what you can do is use that key to identify some of these samples. Okay, so we've got a plant here that has alternate leaves. The leaves have crinkled edges and spiny margins, and the leaves are somewhat lobed. I'm also going to tell you this is a perennial plant. Excuse me, it's got spines on it, and it's still on our noxious weed law. So do we have any guesses on that one yet? So we'll give you about 10 seconds here, and then we'll go ahead and give you the answer. Okay, no guesses yet, so this one is Canada thistle. All right? Okay, we'll go on to our second one. This one ought to be easy. You should be able to get this down to 3 weeds without much thought because I just went over them. Our blade and sheath are hairless. It has a membranous ligule. So again, remember with grasses, you're going to look at stem shape first, and then you're going to look at the ligule. It has clasping auricles, and if it has rhizomes, that means it's a perennial. So if it's a perennial, that means it's not wheat, it's not annual ryegrass. What's this one going to be? We'll give you about 10 seconds on this one. Do we get one, Walt?
Got one from the previous.
Okay.
That must be slow coming in.
Must be slow coming in.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. This one is quackgrass. Okay. This one is a perennial. It reproduces by seed and by underground nutlets. Triangular shaped stem. It has rhizomes. Very commonly found in wet areas, can be found in both lawns and in agronomic fields and pastures. So we'll give you about 10 seconds on this one. And this one is yellow nutsedge. Okay, we'll go through just a couple more here, and then we want to open up the floor if there's any questions in kind of the last 5 minutes. So we have a short membranous ligule. It's going to have a round stem. We're going to have a short membranous ligule, flat hairless leaf blade, and if you remember our discussion of the seed heads, this is going to have an open panicle type of a seed head. So what is this one? Okay, this one is going to be either Johnson grass or shattercane, and in this case, this one is shattercane. Johnson grass and shattercane can be difficult to differentiate. One way you can do it is you can pull plants up. If the plant has rhizomes on it, it's going to be Johnson grass because Johnson grass is a perennial, shattercane is an annual, and shattercane seeds are typically bigger, but also shattercane will typically have wider or fatter leaf blades as well. A little bit more robust plant.
Also has that prominent midvein.
Yes, very prominent midvein on this one that we discussed as well. Okay, why don't we do one more, and then I think we want to open up the floor for questions. So if you have questions, go ahead and start sending those to Walt, because we'll do one more weed ID here, and then we'll go ahead and take your questions. Okay, once again, notice the picture on the right has a very wide midvein. We have a hair-like, a fringe of hairs for a ligule. This is going to have a round stem to get you started out, prominent white midrib, and it's going to have hairs on the underneath side of the first leaf of a young plant. So we'll give you about 10 seconds or so to respond to this one. This one's very commonly found in the fall. I know I've plugged up a combine in some of my research plots when I was a younger man with this weed. This one is fall panicum. Okay, I think that's all the weeds that we're going to show. Looks like we're down to about 3.5 minutes or so left. If you guys have any questions, guys or gals have any questions whatsoever, please send them to Walt. We'll try to address those. Walt, have we had any questions come in yet?
We do have a couple. One of them is it more important to be able to identify specific broadleaf plants or specific grass plants in terms of potentially recommending a herbicide to use?
Okay, so great question. What's more important, grasses or broadleaves? And the answer is yes. No, I'm being a little bit of a smart aleck on that one. The reality of the matter is that in soybeans, our broadleaf weed control problems are the biggest headaches. In corn, our grass weed control problems are typically our biggest headaches. Usually, it's very rare when we're in a situation though where we have either one or the other. Most of the time we're dealing with a composite of weeds, both grasses and broadleaves, and so I think I would focus on both. Typically the grasses are more difficult to identify, so it takes a little bit more skill and practice to do that. Great question.
Another question is, what text are you referencing for the cotyledon identity?
Good question. So we are using a publication that's called Practical Weed Science for the Field Scout. So that, but most of the publications that you'll find will utilize the same text for that. There are some other ones that Joe uses through his work with a clinic. Joe, do you recall the names of those off the top of your head?
Some of those, they won't have that key per se on them, but Weeds of the Northeast or Weeds of the North Central are two of our popular books for identifying most of the weeds that we'll find in this region.
Okay, good.
Another question is there a good pictorial grass ID book or tool available, like a book or a publication?
Yeah, so in terms, and I'll let Joe comment on this as well. Like I said, the one that we've really liked is this one called Practical Weed Science for the Field Scout. So I originally wrote that when I was at the University of Missouri. When I came over here, I've continued to use it for diagnostic training. It's got good pictures, it's got a good key. We're actually going to redo a publication like that here at Purdue because the one from Missouri has gotten so expensive. Joe, do you have any that you would recommend? So again, that's called Practical Weed Science for the Field Scout.
Yeah, so the other one, it won't have the key for broadleafs like we provided, but it has a similar key for the grasses, is that Weeds of the Northeast book. So you have key in the back, you'll have about 15 tables that show differences of common weed species. And then each weed species in that book, and there might be 200 of them, has nice pictures on the right side of the screen or right side of the page, descriptions on the left, and then about a paragraph of similar weed species and some of the subtle differences between them. So that's a really good tool with a lot of pictures and a few keys, maybe not as detailed as what we provided today, that I rely heavily on for some weed identification.
Okay.
I think we can squeeze one more question in. And this one is, will we have to worry about new weeds adapted to wet conditions along the Kankakee River given the recent flooding and very slow draining of the area?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, in terms of what's going to be in the agronomic fields, you know, the biggest headaches that I see people running into are things like the pigweed seeds, sometimes barnyard grass, and things like that that are floating down from whatever was upriver from you. So if you know what your counterparts to the north had for weed problems, that may be what washes in. But you know, a lot of times in these floodplains, the weed problems don't change very dramatically because it's not the first time the area has been flooded. So there usually aren't any huge surprises. Usually the bigger headaches we deal with are how soon can we get back in the field and do the weed control operations. Okay, so I guess we're out of time. I appreciate the audience participation. Certainly send any feedback you have to Walt on how this worked, you know, things that we can do to improve it. And with that, that's basically all we have for today.